In this video, we're going to be talking about perspective. Now, there's a lot of different ways to establish perspective, but we are going to be focusing on something called linear perspective, which is basically using lines and guides to help establish perspective. Now, perspective might be a term that's new to a lot of you guys. So what perspective is perspective is essentially a technique that's used to create this illusion of a 3D space on a 2D surface, right? So we're making something look like it's 3D, even though it's not. It's on a piece of paper, right? But again, it's that illusion of a 3D space on that 2D surface. Now, it's basically our objects appearing to vanish into the distance, right? You can see in this illustration, I was using an image from Venice, where basically there's these beautiful big buildings right along this canal of water. And as you look off into the distance, the buildings get smaller, right? They're receding. So that distance, that horizontal line back there is something called the horizon. So when you're working with perspective, you really want to understand what the horizon is. And basically what it is it's where the sky meets the ground. So it's the furthest possible distance that we can see. So that's why all those buildings, everything is kind of disappearing back onto the horizon. We can't see past that horizon line. Now on the horizon line, we have something called the vanishing point. So that's basically the point on the line that it looks like everything is being pulled into, right? Everything's going into that vanishing point. It's disappearing, it's vanishing as it gets farther out there. So in addition, and a really important term is something called parallel lines. So parallel lines are lines that don't intersect, right? They're in the same position, they are parallel to one another. So next to one another without crossing. Another really important term to know when working with perspective are our receding lines. So these are lines that look like they're going back into space, right? They're going back to the vanishing point, and they're disappearing at that vanishing point. So those lines basically will always line up with that vanishing point on our horizon. So those are the four really key terms that you'll want to be familiar with. All right, so now that I've established my basic buildings and my foundation, you can see I've started to go in with details. So adding things like windows, I added a little balcony, the little boats underneath, all the fun parts. But before you get to a more advanced scene like this, we've got to start at the basics. So with that, I'm going to switch over to my pen and paper, and I hope you guys follow along and try this as well. Because what we're going to do is we are going to start with just creating a basic cube. So to start, as you know, we begin with our horizon, right? Where the sky meets the ground, that furthest distance that we can see. And then, of course, we add our vanishing point. So that's the little dot I am drawing there. And you could draw the vanishing point wherever you want. It doesn't have to be perfectly centered like the last example. It can be off to the left, the right. It's really up to you and your creativity. So our next step is we are just going to draw a square. So I'm using my ruler to get some nice straight edges here, and I'm also referencing the measurements to make sure it's accurate, but I am doing a 2" by 2" square. Now yours can really be whatever size you want, of course, but you just want to make sure that it is consistent on each edge to get that nice perfect square. All right, then once we have the square, what we're going to do is our next step. And our next step is to draw the receding lines, right? So if you recall, those are the lines that extend from our shape, which could be our building, or in this case, our square, and it extends all the way to that vanishing point, right? So I'm just going to connect each of those corners of the square to that vanishing point. So then we've got our 3 receding lines. Once we have those receding lines established, our next step is going to be to draw parallel lines, so lines parallel to our square further back. Okay, so I'm sticking with just a straight horizontal line and drawing that parallel to the top of my square. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the left side of our square. So now it's not just a square, it's 3D, it's a cube, right? We've got our cube. So then I've got all these extra lines, so you can just go ahead and erase those. We really don't need those anymore because our goal was to create a cube. Now I'm going to fast forward here because you really don't have to do this part. I just want to make sure that it was easy enough to see the cube. So I'm just outlining it in black and then throwing in some shading on top. But there we have our final cube. Alright, so next we're going to make something a little more challenging. Not super hard, but a little more challenging. We're stepping it up. So we are going to be drawing a streetscape. So essentially a street receding into the distance with some buildings off to the side. So of course we start off with our horizon. So again, that furthest distance we can see in the back. Also where the sky touches the ground. And then of course adding our vanishing points. And then to create that road, I'm just making 2 receding lines. So again, going from our vanishing point off to the edge of our paper. And of course, as things are closest to us, or closer to us, they appear bigger. As they go further into the distance, they seem smaller. So it's the same thing with our street, right? It's close to us, it's larger, and then it gets smaller as it recedes, as it goes back towards the vanishing point where it disappears. Alright, so then our next step is to draw a rectangle. So the corner of your rectangle should be touching the street. That rectangle is going to become the front of our building, right? So the front of the building that's facing us. And then what we're going to do is once we have that face of the building, we're going to take some parallel vertical lines. Basically what that means is we're connecting the corner of our block, just like we did with the cube. We're connecting that corner to the vanishing point. Okay, and then we're drawing out that receding line. So that receding line is now going to become the top of the side of our building. So we can draw another parallel line to create that side of the building. Now I want there to be multiple buildings. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to repeat everything I just did. I'm going to draw a rectangle, but the rectangle is touching the other building. So again, drawing out that rectangle, and then once I create it, I'm going to create another receding line. And then of course that receding line is used to create the top of my next building. Okay, so we're just basically repeating that step of drawing rectangles and then drawing receding lines that we use as our guides to create the sides of our building. So I'm going to speed it up here since I'm just kind of going through those same steps, and I'm also going to go to an outline in black just so it's a little bit more clear to see. But then of course we can always remove a lot of those extra lines that we have. Since they were just there for guides, we no longer really need them for our building. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to add a little bit of fun details. So I'm going to add, still keeping it simple, but I'm going to add a door in here and some windows. So to do that, I just started with a parallel line, right, to be where I want the edge of my door to be. And then I'm going to draw out another receding line to use as my guide. And then that's how I'll create my door. Now with this Sharpie, I'm not using a ruler, but I probably should. My lines would be a lot cleaner and a lot straighter. A ruler is definitely recommended. A ruler is definitely recommended for all of these steps. Keeps everything nice and tidy and nice and straight and organized. Alright, and then I'm drawing the next door for the next building, repeating the same steps, the parallel line and our receding line as a guide. Now, as you know, of course, as the buildings get smaller, as they go further into the distance, the doors would as well, the windows would get smaller, everything gets smaller as it goes further off into the distance. Alright, and then we can start to have fun with it. We can add more windows along the buildings, extra details, and all the fun stuff like that. You can get bricks, you can really get fancy with it. So that is really how we use 1-point perspective. Now there is something else called 2-point perspective, and there's 3-point perspective and more, but basically I don't want you to stress about that yet. I really want you to master 1-point perspective first. But just so you're aware of it, you know, there are other forms of perspective where sometimes there's multiple vanishing points. So if we're looking at a building at a corner, for example, we would have our buildings, we'd have our sidewalk receding in 2 different directions. So this is really good when you want to see 2 perpendicular sides of an object, and both would be a little more distorted or foreshortened, which again, as you know, that means it's just kind of receding into the distance. So it's really good for that non-perpendicular view. So things like the street corner are a really prime example. And then there's multi-point perspective. There's a lot more out there, but I hope this was helpful just to get a feel for the basics and start to get an understanding of one point perspective.